What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering the new Venom. This is the beginning of the run by Ewing. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to tell you this ahead of time. After reading through this story, if you did not like Ewing's Immortal Hulk, you will not like this. These two things basically are identical in terms of how he writes them and how they're drawn. Having said that, Immortal Hulk had its lull periods, it had its slow moments, but overall, it was great. You know, kind of sitting back and looking at it, like, it was just one of the most unique, incredible Hulk stories that had ever been written, seemingly since the days of Bill Mantlo and Peter David, right? Really Bill Mantlo more than Peter David, but this one feels like it's going to be a lot the same way. So it's going to be a very cerebral story and a lot of new concepts and some other concepts that Ewing is actually built on or created. They're going to be thrown in here. Specifically, some of the stuff that we saw from the Ultimates, if that gives you any indication. Initially, this picks up with what really looks like pandemonium, right? Like a hotel room being trashed and basically all these soldiers, and Venom just kind of jumping into the fray and seemingly attacking all these people. At that moment, you switch over to about 12 hours before all this kicked off. And what you end up doing is joining with Eddie Brock. Now, a little bit of a refresher here for those of you guys who don't really recall where we left off with Eddie Brock, that you basically had Knull, the symbiote god, essentially the being who created the symbiotes in the first place. He had basically returned, he conscripted the symbiotes, he actually took over Celestials using the living darkness, and then in turn started quite literally cutting a swath through the universe. I know it's been a long time since we used that phrase, cutting a swath, but he basically led this huge crusade, this rampage across the universe, conquered countless worlds, all that kind of stuff, until eventually he arrived on Earth. And then eventually Eddie Brock got his hands on what was basically the Enigma Force. He became Captain Universe and then defeated Knull. Following that, he took his place. And so where Eddie Brock is not really a villain, instead he's basically a hero now, what's happening is that he is essentially controlling the symbiotes from a remote location, right? So the symbiotes exist out there in space through all corners of the universe. And the idea is that in the early days, the symbiotes were, after the defeat of Knull and them kind of becoming their own thing until Knull rose again, they were space knights, right? So the role the symbiotes would play is they would bond themselves to individuals and then they would become protectors, not unlike the Green Lantern Corps from DC Comics, albeit the mode and the method by which they operated was different. It was more or less the same concept in terms of how far reaching they were. And so that's basically where they've returned to, right? That with Eddie Brock leading the charge, kind of controlling them, being able to jump from one mind to the next, that he's basically leading this giant army of symbiotes across the universe, basically trying to save lives where he can. And what he ends up doing is coming across a ship that's on a mission of mercy, right? It's really more, at least as he describes it, as a ship that's basically a relief freighter, right? So it's got medicine, it's got food, different things like that. And this is just kind of the aftermath of the King in Black. Because so many worlds were conquered, because so many worlds were pillaged or even destroyed, that there's basically a lot of relief efforts underway across the universe where people are sending supplies to whoever they can in order to try to get the universe back up to where it was supposed to be. It's not one of these things that you see very often these days. You saw it all the time during the days of like Dan Abnett when he was doing the whole like cosmic opera, right? So like everything from Annihilation going forward, which is still probably the best era of spacefaring stories in the history of Marvel Comics. We need to cover the entirety of Dan Abnett's run one day. Like, we need to do that. I mean, we already covered it in bits and pieces, right? Like Thanos Imperative, different things like that, but we should cover it all. One of the things to keep in mind here is that these four symbiotes are by and large kind of autonomous. The reason why you see at least one of the symbiotes that looks more like Venom than the others, it's really more of just an artistic depiction to show us which one Eddie Brock is controlling. And that's the way it works. His consciousness jumps from one to the next. So essentially he can be in a room with one symbiote and then jump to the mind of another symbiote, take that one over, and then just kind of operate there accordingly. So it's a pretty ingenious way in terms of how he functions. But as they make their way through the ships, they basically end up finding that, of course, space pirates have taken this thing. Now, that's just part and parcel to what's going on out there right now, right? Like anytime you have a situation where there is a dire need for a particular product, you're going to have people who are basically going to hijack that process and essentially become pirates, right? Like selling them off for super high amounts of money. Here on Earth in the modern era, we call them scalpers, right? But they're still basically the same thing, pirates more or less. And so as a result of this, it's one of these things where like these symbiotes kind of go through and basically face off against these guys. But one of the other things to understand is that even though they are pirates and they are basically bad guys, that they still don't trust the concept of symbiotes. Now, this is something Ewing gives us, is not just a reflection of these pirates, but basically most life across the universe. That because Knull had conquered so many different worlds or destroyed so many different worlds, it has forever changed the way that people see symbiotes. In time, that will change, but at the moment, they distrust them greatly. And so it's one of those things where it's like attack on sight as soon as you see him. It's pretty wild in terms of how this works. But switching back over to Dylan, right, the son of Eddie Brock from the whole King in Black event and all that kind of stuff, one of the things you see here is that where he had basically been left on Earth by Eddie, and Eddie has spent more and more time away from Earth trying to be a protector across the universe using his Venom army, basically his symbiote army, that in a lot of ways it's left Dylan to his own devices. And one of the things to know is that when you're younger, when you're somebody like Dylan, who I wouldn't say has been raised in a life of conflict, but who was physically abused by his grandfather, one of the things he's learned is that violence solves everything. Now, in all honesty, and let's be truthful here, violence is not always the answer. That's true. But as you guys have heard me say countless times, it is a answer and is usually a very effective one. And so Dylan is really kind of taking that approach. The problem is he's going too extreme with it. And so basically getting into fights, different things like that. When he's called into the principal's office, the response is, if we can't get a hold of your dad, we're going to have to inform the board of education, and ultimately we're going to have to kick you out of the school, right? We'll have to expel you for what you're doing. And so one of the big things that Dylan is contending with is not only the struggle of just coming of age, right? I mean, a lot of you guys who are young, who have been through this process, I remember this process, you guys understand it's a lot of hormones, a lot of confusion. You don't know who you are, where you're going, what you're about, how you feel about things seemingly changes all the time. You almost feel like you're not in control of your own life. And so where Dylan is trying to deal with that whole process, just the price you pay for growing up, he also has to deal with abandonment issues, the feeling that like his father abandoned him in order to be a protector of the universe, that Dylan's just not more important than that. And where Dylan does try to reconcile this with, well, I mean, it is the universe and he is a protector, at the end of the day, he still feels like his father abandoned him. And so as a result of that, this is a lot of anger issue that's coming out, right? A lot of anger problems that are manifesting here and in his frustration with how he feels like he's been abandoned by his father. And so where Eddie Brock is basically able to tangle up, all these pirates or whatever and deal with them, one of the symbiotes that he had nicknamed Ringo, he basically sent into the cargo hold to check on all the people who were there. And as soon as he gets there, you end up finding out that this symbiote basically killed everybody in there. But it wasn't just the symbiote going awry. That's the first thing I want to establish here. And the way that Al Ewing does this is fantastic. It's the same thing he did in Immortal Hulk, right? Like he teased this concept and was like, this is going to be the main idea going throughout the entirety of this run, however long this run may last. And so where this happens, Eddie Brock steps in here, realizes all these innocent people have basically been slaughtered. The symbiote starts speaking to him, right? And it says, don't sit too comfortably on your throne, King in Black. Soon, it will be empty. This is not a threat, not a warning, simply a statement of fact. You will not know the day nor the hour. You won't see it coming, Eddie. So say your goodbyes now. Talk to the people you love, your son, your other. Tell them to run. Tell them to hide. It won't make any difference. And it's one of the things that Eddie Brock kind of communicates here, right? That he says that the way this thing talks, it almost kind of comes across as though it's basically already won. And where it's saying things like, this is a message from the future, that kind of seems to be solidified, right? That like basically it's already won, that Eddie Brock has already lost and there's no way for him to stop himself from losing. But as you guys know, Eddie Brock was never one to just roll over, right? He was never one to just say, okay, well, I mean, I guess I lost, might as well just kind of give up, and call it a day. He's the one to always keep fighting, right? To always keep going as best he can to come out on top. And so what he ends up doing is basically racing back to Dylan as fast as he can, wakes him up out of a dead sleep and says like, you have to get dressed. And he asks him, he's like, where's the symbiote, right? Where's Venom? And the response that Dylan gives him is, well, he just kind of goes out and does his own thing. I mean, I guess he's trying to figure out, his place in all of this, but like he does his own thing. And there really haven't been any Venom sightings. He hasn't like consumed anybody. So I figured everything was okay. And so the response of Eddie is, okay, fine, whatever. As always, the rule is do not bond to the Venom symbiote, right? You can use it if you need to, but do not actually bond to it, right? Do not stick with it for any real measure of time, but get dressed, get your stuff packed. We got to get out of here as fast as we possibly can. Now, here's the crazy thing about this is that while all that's happening, his phone starts buzzing. And when he goes to answer it, it's his dad. It's Eddie Brock, who tells him, hey son, you're in serious danger here, right? You are in incredible danger. It's in there with you. Now, we're not really given a definitive what it is, but we can largely assume it's whatever it was that took control of that Ringo symbiote that was talking to Eddie and killed all those innocent people. How far reaching this goes, we don't know. We don't really know what we're dealing with here. We simply know we're just dealing with some kind of a force that claims to be able to send messages from the future. But whatever it is, it's able to seemingly take on the forms of other people. And so this really seems like the legitimate Eddie Brock who's talking to his son, where Dylan says like, how do I know it's you, right? Like, how do I know it's actually you and not somebody else pretending to be you? And he's like, because I'm your father, Dylan, right? And he's like, how do I know I can trust you? And he says, you don't. You just have to trust yourself. Answer the question, Is it me, or is it somebody else that's talking to you on the phone right now? And ultimately, Dylan ends up siding with the version of his dad on the phone, and then basically leaves that, that other person behind, which more or less seems to kind of be a symbiote. Now, one of the things that happens is that as Eddie talks to his son, it's a bit of a reminder that it really is Eddie Brock, right? He says, I wish I could talk you through it, son, but I don't have a lot of time. I need you to go to the old motel by the exit to Central. You remember the one with the diner, with the burnt pancakes that you always hated. He says, go now. I'm in room 112. I'll see you there. And he says, remember, Dylan, don't draw any attention to yourself. Don't get into any trouble. And I know you said you haven't seen Venom, but in case you do, remember, don't bond with the symbiote. And one of the things that's really kind of cool here is that you've got Eddie in this hotel room just kind of mulling over everything that's going on. And one of the things that he says here is that, like, at the end of the day, he wishes he could have told his son that he loved him, right? He wished he could have said, Dylan, I love you, but he said there was so much other stuff to say. There were so many other warnings that needed to be given to him. And so he's like, now I'm second guessing every single decision that I made. Maybe I could just leave him a message, right? Maybe I could just leave a message here in this location and like that would be it. But at the end of the day, Eddie starts thinking and he comes to this realization, if this thing, whatever it was able to communicate to me through essentially hijacking one of my symbiotes and I wasn't able to retake control, and it told me it was sending a message from the future, then we're talking about time. And so then his mind starts wondering even further and he says, okay, like according to Einstein, time and space are the same. You can't separate one. You can't travel through time, but not travel through space at the same time. It doesn't work that way. They go hand in hand. And so his idea is, if I can send my consciousness into a symbiote on the other side of the universe, then what if I can send my mind into a symbiote at any point in the timeline, right? Like into the future, into the past. Now, this is huge. It doesn't seem like it's huge, but this is huge because this potentially introduces the idea that Eddie Brock can manipulate time. That's big. Now, this is not something where it's like Eddie Brock can manipulate time because he's got powers. It's really just the fact that the symbiotes serve as a bridge by way he can do that, right? Where it's one of the things that really seemed to give Knull the upper hand in a multitude of circumstances because he had basically already saw how he'd won, right? So how that reconciles with the ending of King in Black and all that kind of stuff, I don't really know, right? I'm just kind of spitballing here, just throwing out ideas. But Eddie Brock does that, right? He sends his mind seemingly into the future and he gets a few small glimpses, right? The boy is our only priority, which is what a pilot in a helicopter says. You end up seeing what looks like a giant symbiotic monster that says, Bedlam is my name, right? Kang the Conqueror appears, which makes perfect sense if it is some kind of event that takes place in the future, right? And he says, I tell you this as your oldest friend, Edward, you cannot win. Now, we don't know if Kang the Conqueror is saying that as he observes Eddie Brock moving through time and basically gives him a warning, or if that's like a conversation that takes place in the future. Seemingly it will be. That's kind of how Al Ewing handled things when it came to the Immortal Hulk. All the stuff you see here are things that we're going to see later on down the road, right? Whether it's at the end of this comic or things in like 20 issues, right? Whatever it happens to be, it'll be things that you end up seeing. The problem with this is that because of the whole experience, seemingly this whole ordeal, and the fact that one, taking over the mind of a symbiote and controlling symbiotes across the universe is already mentally taxing, this is doubly so. So he actually ends up passing out. Now, of course, he wakes up, Dylan's basically calling him, and then ultimately Eddie's response is, no, like I shouldn't have stayed here. I shouldn't have told him to come and meet me here. They could follow him here. They could arrive here. His hope was to bail out and leave a message for his son so his son would know what to do next. But the fact that he basically passed out, time has passed, Dylan is now here. And so he's like, okay, fine, then we'll do what we have to do, right? We'll basically work together as best we can, and I'll have to keep him safe every step of the way. The problem is that in the middle of all this, suddenly like these just military-grade helicopters come out of nowhere, fire rockets in the hotel, and basically end up killing Eddie Brock. And Eddie Brock is totally destroyed here. Now, this is one of the coolest things from this comic, because you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino's Old Man Logan. You guys remember that segment during Border Town when like Old Man Logan started flipping out? He went into his berserker mode and he was just like, let myself become wrath, let myself become death, right? Just like he just totally like just immerses himself, right? Just lets himself fall into his berserker rage. This is like that seemingly the other basically arrives on the scene, right? The Venom symbiote saves Dylan, bonds itself to Dylan, even though Dylan knows that's not supposed to happen, and he kills everyone, right? Like everyone. I mean, this kind of wraps back around to the very beginning, but basically he kills everybody here, all these soldiers, he just kills them all. And it's not like there's 5 or 6 soldiers or a few soldiers in helicopters, there's dozens of them, and all of them get killed by Dylan as Venom, right? He just goes on this rampage, just losing himself in this whole thing. And that's one of the things that's kind of commented here is this is how it all begins. So seemingly the indication is it's Dylan. Dylan becomes evil, corrupted. So really kind of seemingly seemingly tying back into the work of what Donny Cates did when he basically gave us this kind of futuristic story where Dylan ended up becoming what was basically an agent of Knull, and then in turn was controlling all the symbiotes across the world and actually killed the world's superheroes and most of the population and turned them into symbiotes, and then in turn they all work for him. That it looks like it might be some form of a game of global domination. Now, while that may seem pretty basic and kind of lame, do not take that as an absolute truth. You talk to anybody who read Immortal Hulk, it seemed pretty basic to begin with. By the time you got midway through, it was phenomenal. It was just this ridiculously great story. So do not write this off based on the first issue. I don't know why you would. I don't know why you would read one issue of a comic and then be like, this sucks, the whole thing's gonna be dumb, and then throw it away. I don't really know why you would take that stance. But nonetheless, you basically switch over to what is in effect the consciousness of Eddie Brock as he just kind of is seemingly flown through time and then eventually wakes up in this place, right? Almost a sort of garden, almost a kind of lush and green planet that has these very strange exotic colors and flora and fauna. And so this voice seemingly comes out of nowhere and it says, welcome, don't try to talk. You've just reconstituted yourself from the available matter. You'll need a minute to gain your bearings. This is your first step on a long, long road. And he says, but I'll be with you every step of the way. And he says, my name is Meridius, and here at the furthest end of all that is, I welcome you to my garden. What it looks like here is Eddie Brock's in the Far Shore. That's what it looks like. And if it is, that's cool. I love the Far Shore. The Far Shore is like the greatest concept that Marvel never did anything with. Okay, so here's something to understand when it comes to, I guess, how the Far Shore works, right? So you guys know in Marvel Comics, you have like the multiverse, right? Like seemingly an endless number of universes. So imagine this is all in like a giant circle, kind of how the way DC does their multiverse. And then you might have a layer, right? The layer around that might be something like the negative zone. And then beyond that would be like the realm of death. And then beyond that is the Far Shore. Now, beyond that is like the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be. Anything that could possibly happen that hasn't happened yet, that's that realm. And then beyond the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be, that's when you get into the Beyonders. But the Far Shore is basically the realm of like the one above all. That's really what it is, right? Like the place beyond everything. So it's where like all those meetings that you see in Marvel Comics where like the Living Tribunal is meeting with the cosmic entities and they're in like a giant empty space. That's the Far Shore, right? It's something that was recently introduced and expanded on in Marvel, but that's basically the Far Shore. That in effect, Eddie Brock is just past all of creation. He's moved far beyond any of that stuff. Now, what this means for his character, I have no clue, but I will say this, man, I am excited to find out. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.